When the bus pulled through the gates of Camp Lejeune, the new recruits craned their necks to catch glimpses of the massive compound that would soon grind them down and rebuild them into Marines. Among them sat Elena Ramirez, her dark hair tied back tightly, her jaw clenched as though she were already bracing for battle. She knew what the others saw when they looked at her. A petite young woman from New Mexico with slender shoulders and hands that seemed more suited to sketchbooks than weapons. From the moment she stepped onto the gravel lot, duffels slung over her back, she felt the stares. Some were curious, some mocking, and a few downright hostile. "Hope she doesn't break a nail," one recruit muttered loud enough for the others to hear. A ripple of laughter followed, and Elena pressed her lips together, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. She hadn't come here to make friends. She had come here to prove something, even if she had to claw her way through every sneer and insult. The drill instructors wasted no time stripping away any sense of comfort. Shouts, whistles, and the thundering cadence of boots pounded across the asphalt. Recruits scrambled into formation, their duffels hitting the ground in unison. Elena stood ramrod straight, her eyes locked forward, pretending not to hear the whispered jokes about how long she'd last. They saw weakness, but they didn't know her story. They didn't know she had grown up on a dusty stretch of desert where her father, a retired Army Ranger, had taught her discipline with the same rigor he applied to himself. They didn't know she had spent weekends at the range since the age of 12, squeezing off rounds until her shoulder ached, learning how to control her breathing, how to steady her aim no matter what chaos buzzed around her. They didn't know the weight she carried inside, the drive to honor a father who never stopped believing she was capable of more than the world expected of her. The first week was a blur of shouted orders, aching muscles, and sleepless nights. Recruits stumbled through push-ups, obstacle courses, and endless drills. Elena pushed herself harder than anyone else, refusing to show fatigue even when her arms trembled or when sweat soaked her uniform. Still, the laughter followed her. When she fumbled with her gear on the first day, someone snickered, "Careful, princess, that's not a handbag." When her helmet slipped too low during a march, another whispered, "Maybe she should have stayed in ballet class." She ignored it all, burying her anger deep, waiting. There would be a chance, she knew, to silence every one of them. That chance came the day they were marched to the firing range. The instructors barked orders as the recruits lined up behind the racks of rifles. Elena felt her pulse quicken at the sight of the weapons. The M16s gleamed under the sun, their steel bodies lined up like silent sentinels. For most recruits, this was the moment they had anticipated with both excitement and fear. The first chance to prove their marksmanship, the first chance to measure themselves against the standards of the Corps. For Elena it was something else. It was a test she had been preparing for her whole life. But as she stepped forward and reached for a rifle, she heard the laughter again. "Don't drop it, sweetheart," one of the taller recruits said, his smirk widening as the others chuckled. "Looks bigger than you are." Another added, "Bet she couldn't hit the side of a barn." The group erupted in laughter that carried across the range. Even a couple of instructors hid faint grins, though they said nothing. Elena's fingers closed around the weapon, and in that instant, something shifted inside her. She didn't argue. She didn't fire back with words. Instead, she simply shouldered the rifle, checking the sights, feeling its weight as naturally as if it had always belonged there. The laughter died down, replaced by a watchful silence. When the command was given, the first wave of recruits stepped to the line. The air filled with the crack of gunfire, brass casings clattering onto the concrete, and the sharp smell of cordite drifting through the breeze. Elena watched every movement, calm and calculating, the way her father had taught her. Observe, adapt, focus. When her turn came, she stepped forward without hesitation. The rifle felt steady against her shoulder, her cheek resting on the stock, her eye locked on the target downrange. Her breathing slowed until the world narrowed to the space between her sights and the bullseye. Then she squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out, the recoil familiar, almost comforting. The bullet tore through the paper target with deadly precision. She squeezed again, then again, her rhythm unshakable, her aim unwavering. Each round punched closer to the center, grouping tighter than any other on the line. By the time her magazine was empty, the chatter behind her had gone silent. She lowered the rifle, ejected the magazine, and stood at attention, her face unreadable. The instructors moved down the line, checking targets, barking critiques. But when they reached Elena's, their voices faltered. Nearly every shot had torn through the center, a cluster so tight it looked as though a single hole had been punched straight through the paper. A murmur spread among the recruits. The same ones who had laughed now stared, their expressions shifting from amusement to disbelief. One of the instructors called out her score, his voice carrying across the range, highest in the unit. Silence followed, thick and heavy, until someone let out a low whistle. Elena didn't smile. She didn't need to. She simply stood tall, her rifle resting at her side, her eyes fixed straight ahead. Inside, though, she felt the fire of vindication. They had laughed when she grabbed the rifle. They weren't laughing now. The atmosphere on the range had shifted, though no one wanted to admit it out loud. The recruits filed back into formation, rifles slung, sweat streaking down their faces as the sun beat mercilessly overhead. Elena stood among them, her breathing steady, her mind replaying the shots she had taken. She didn't need to gloat. The paper target spoke louder than words ever could. The others, however, weren't sure what to do with what they had just witnessed. Some avoided her gaze, their earlier confidence punctured like balloons, while a few still muttered excuses under their breath. Maybe she got lucky, maybe the wind had been just right, maybe it wouldn't happen again. Elena heard every word, but she let it slide past her. She knew how quickly people clung to excuses when their pride was on the line. Pride, she thought, was a fragile thing. Skill was not. The drill instructors, for their part, had taken notice. Staff Sergeant Miller, a towering man with a voice like gravel, called the unit to attention. His eyes, cold and sharp, flicked over Elena, lingering only a moment before he barked for the recruits to fall in for the run back to the barracks. No recognition, no praise, just another order. Elena respected that. She didn't come here for compliments. Still, she caught the faintest flicker in his eyes. A flicker that said he had seen enough Marines to know the difference between a fluke and raw talent. She filed that away in her mind like ammunition saved for later. The next few days were grueling. The unit endured endless drills, night watches, and the brutal obstacle course known as the grinder. Recruits stumbled and cursed, dragging themselves over walls, crawling through mud, and choking on dust clouds kicked up by boots in front of them. Elena forced herself through every challenge, her body screaming in protest but her will refusing to yield. When others collapsed in exhaustion, she pressed forward. When her arms shook under the weight of push-ups, she imagined her father standing behind her, urging her to dig deeper. But despite her relentless drive, the ridicule had not disappeared entirely. Some recruits still couldn't stand the idea that she had outshot them. The louder ones doubled down, sneering in passing, whispering about how she wouldn't last once the real pressure began. Yet more and more their words rang hollow because when the instructors demanded excellence, Elena delivered. The second time they went to the range, the stakes were higher. This wasn't just basic marksmanship practice, it was qualification day. Scores today would determine where each recruit stood in the eyes of the Corps. Elena approached the line with the same calm focus as before. The murmurs behind her were quieter now, more uncertain. She could feel their eyes boring into her back, waiting to see if she could repeat her earlier performance or if she would crumble under pressure. She didn't give them the satisfaction of hesitation. She took her position, locked her sights, and fired. Shot after shot landed dead center. By the end of the session, her target looked less like a paper silhouette and more like a single gaping wound in the middle. The instructors couldn't ignore it this time. Staff Sergeant Miller's voice cut across the field, rough but carrying a weight that silenced the entire company. Ramirez. Top marks. Again. He didn't add praise, but he didn't need to. The fact that he had singled her out in front of everyone spoke volumes. The recruits shifted uncomfortably, some shaking their heads, others staring at her with something closer to respect than ridicule. The laughter that had once followed her every step seemed to have evaporated, replaced by an uneasy acknowledgement. Elena caught one of the louder skeptics, the tall recruit who had mocked her the loudest, glaring at her as if her very existence were an insult. She met his glare with an expression of absolute calm until he was the one who looked away. Back at the barracks that night, the atmosphere was different. The jokes that had once been thrown casually in her direction now came only in whispers, and even those were laced with uncertainty. A few recruits, emboldened by curiosity rather than scorn, began to ask her questions. "Where'd you learn to shoot like that?" one asked quietly while cleaning his rifle. Elena simply replied, "My father taught me." Nothing more, nothing less. She didn't need to elaborate. The truth was simple and it was enough. Others began to drift closer, no longer treating her as an outsider but as someone who carried a skill they respected, even if begrudgingly. Respect in the Corps wasn't given. It was earned, usually in sweat, blood, or skill. Elena had earned it with steel and precision. But not everyone was ready to accept the shift. Tensions began to simmer, subtle at first, then more apparent. The tall recruit, Michaels, she learned his name was, seemed determined to undermine her at every turn. If she ran fast, he ran harder, shouting loud enough for others to hear that speed didn't matter if you couldn't handle combat weight. If she carried gear flawlessly, he pointed out that strength meant nothing without endurance. His words didn't sting, but the intent behind them was clear. He wasn't ready to let go of his pride. Elena didn't respond. She let him talk, knowing full well that actions, not words, carried weight in this place. And when the time came, she would outpace him just as she had outshot him. One night, lying in her bunk while the barracks settled into uneasy silence, Elena thought about the path ahead. Boot camp was only the beginning. Beyond it lay deployments, real battles, life and death choices where skill and grit mattered more than bravado. She thought of her father's stories, the way he described the cold weight of responsibility when lives depended on a steady hand and a sharp mind. She carried that weight already, even if the others couldn't see it yet. They would. She was determined not just to match the Marines around her but to surpass them, to etch her place in a world that had doubted her from the start. The day would come when no one laughed at her presence, when her name would stand as proof that ability knew no gender, no stereotype. She could feel it. But for now she focused on the next challenge, the next drill, the next chance to prove herself. And as sleep finally overtook her, she held one thought close like a shield. Every step forward, every shot fired, every moment endured brought her closer to the day when doubt would die and respect would be the only thing left in its place. The transformation within the unit was slow, almost grudging, but it was there. By the third week of training, Elena was no longer treated as a fragile outsider to be mocked. Instead, she was regarded as an anomaly, someone who disrupted the natural order of expectations. Marines prided themselves on toughness, and most of the recruits had built their identities around the idea that their strength, their size, or their aggression defined their worth. Elena's presence had challenged that unspoken belief. She wasn't the loudest, the strongest, or the biggest, yet she kept pushing past every test, silent but relentless. It unsettled them because it meant the old rules didn't apply. Respect had to be recalibrated, and some recruits didn't know how to process that shift. Every morning began with the same ritual: reveille blasting at dawn, boots hitting the ground, the thunder of shouted commands as drill instructors stormed through the barracks like hurricanes. Fatigue clung to everyone, a constant haze that no amount of caffeine or determination could erase. Yet Elena rose with the same composure every day, never complaining, never dragging her feet. When others slumped under the weight of gear during long marches, she pushed forward with steady steps, eyes fixed ahead, her breathing even. She had learned long ago from her father that battles weren't just about skill but endurance, the ability to suffer longer, harder, without breaking. That lesson was becoming her greatest weapon here. It wasn't lost on the instructors either. Staff Sergeant Miller, whose hawk-like eyes missed nothing, began watching her with closer scrutiny. He never praised her openly, that wasn't his way, but he adjusted his tone when addressing her, barking orders with a sharper edge as if to test her limits. If he demanded 10 pull-ups from others, he made her do 15. If the run ended at 3 miles, he ordered her to keep going for another lap. Some recruits whispered that he was trying to break her. Elena understood the truth. He was testing her, not out of spite, but out of curiosity. He had seen her skill, and now he wanted to know if her resilience matched it. She welcomed the challenge. Every extra demand was another chance to prove that her presence wasn't a fluke. The simmering rivalry with Michaels came to a head during one of those punishing days. The unit was sent on a forced march through swampy terrain, their packs weighing heavy, mud sucking at their boots, mosquitoes whining in their ears. Was miserable, the kind of test designed to strip away bravado and reveal who could endure. Elena kept her pace steady, every step fueled by determination. Michaels, towering and broad-shouldered, pushed himself harder whenever he caught sight of her ahead of him. He gritted his teeth, refusing to let her lead. 4 hours, the two of them marched, neck and neck, the unspoken competition burning between them. By the time they staggered back to camp, others collapsed onto the ground, groaning and panting. Elena dropped her pack with controlled precision, her chest heaving but her eyes steady. Michaels, drenched in sweat and gasping for air, shot her a look filled with both hatred and reluctant respect. Later that night, while the recruits cleaned their rifles in silence, one of them finally broke the tension. "You two gonna kill each other before graduation," a younger recruit muttered, half joking. Michael scowled but said nothing. Elena didn't reply either. She simply kept working, her hands moving over the weapon with practiced care. She wasn't here for petty rivalries. But she knew that every challenge Michaels threw at her only sharpened her edge. In his attempt to push her down, he was unknowingly driving her forward. The next test wasn't one of endurance but precision under stress. The instructors staged a combat simulation, complete with the chaos of shouted commands, smoke grenades, and the crack of simulated gunfire. Recruits had to move through the course, identify targets, and fire accurately while sprinting between cover. Mistakes would cost points, hesitation would cost time, and poor marksmanship would expose weaknesses brutally. The moment Elena entered the course, her senses sharpened. She tuned out the noise, the chaos, the sting of smoke in her eyes. Her world narrowed to targets and timing. She moved low and fast, rifle tight to her shoulder, breathing steady as she fired. Each target fell with precision, her shots clean and centered. When she reached the end, her time was among the fastest, her accuracy nearly perfect. When the scores were posted, a buzz spread among the recruits. Elena had not just outshot the majority, she had outshot all of them, including Michaels. His name, once assumed to be near the top, was buried lower down the list. He stormed off, his pride cracking under the weight of undeniable numbers. Elena didn't gloat. She simply studied the results, then returned to cleaning her gear as if it were just another task. But the others noticed. Whispers of admiration replaced the earlier ridicule. Some began to look at her not as an outsider but as a standard to chase. That night, as she lay in her bunk staring at the ceiling, Elena thought about what had shifted. The laughter that had once surrounded her had vanished entirely, replaced by silence, grudging respect, or quiet curiosity. Even Michaels, as bitter as he remained, could no longer deny what the scores showed. She had come into this place underestimated, written off before she had even begun. Now, every step, every shot, every drop of sweat was building a reputation she hadn't expected to earn so quickly. But she also knew this was only the beginning. Boot camp was designed to weed out the weak, to break the uncommitted, and to forge the rest into Marines. Outshooting her unit was one victory. Becoming a Marine was the larger battle. And Elena Ramirez had no intention of losing. By the fourth week, Elena had become a paradox to the rest of the unit, both a target of scrutiny and a beacon of silent inspiration. The Marines prided themselves on grit and iron discipline, but Elena had introduced something new into their world, the uncomfortable reality that ability could outshine stereotype, and that skill could humble even the loudest voices. The whispers had shifted. Where once she was mocked, now she was studied. Recruits watched her carefully, noting how she handled her rifle, how she carried her gear, how she moved with a quiet efficiency that made the rest of them seem clumsy by comparison. She never explained herself, never offered lessons, never sought to correct anyone else. But the others were learning anyway, whether they admitted it or not. It was during the combat drills that the instructors decided to raise the stakes. This time, the recruits weren't just being tested individually, they would be evaluated as squads, forced to coordinate under simulated battlefield conditions. The instructors set up an urban training course, a maze of ruined buildings, narrow alleys, and obstacles designed to replicate the chaos of real combat. Squads had to navigate the terrain, eliminate enemy targets, rescue a mock casualty, and reach the extraction point under a strict time limit. Teamwork mattered as much as marksmanship. And for Elena, this was the first time she would have to depend on others instead of simply proving herself alone. Her squad was a mixture of strong personalities. Michaels, still bristling with resentment, Torres, a quick-witted recruit with a knack for strategy, Jensen, who cracked jokes to hide his nerves, and Williams, quiet but dependable. Elena said little as they planned their approach. She listened, observing the dynamics. Michaels immediately tried to take control, barking out orders, convinced his height and confidence made him the natural leader. The others half listened, reluctant but unsure of what else to do. Elena waited until he finished, then quietly pointed out flaws in his plan. A blind corner he hadn't accounted for, a choke point that would bottleneck them, an extraction route too exposed to simulated fire. At first Michaels sneered, but Torres backed her up, nodding that Elena's adjustments made sense. Reluctantly, the squad adopted her changes. When the simulation began, chaos erupted. Smoke grenades hissed, loudspeakers blared the sounds of distant gunfire, and instructors shouted over megaphones to mimic battlefield confusion. The squad moved quickly, ducking through alleys, scanning rooftops, firing at pop-up targets that appeared without warning. Elena kept her rifle tight to her shoulder, firing clean, precise bursts that dropped every target in her sights. Michaels fired aggressively, often spraying rounds too quickly, missing shots that Elena then had to clean up. Torres coordinated movement, shouting directions that kept the squad from collapsing into disorder. When they reached the casualty dummy, a heavy sandbag dressed in fatigues, it was Elena who stepped forward, heaving it onto her shoulders without hesitation. The weight bit into her muscles, but she didn't slow. She had carried heavier loads under her father's watch back home. Pain was temporary, mission success was permanent. They pushed through the final stretch, Elena carrying the dummy while still firing with her free hand, her accuracy barely faltering. Michaels, desperate to reassert himself, tried to rush the last barricade but exposed himself carelessly. The instructors fired blanks at him, marking him hit. Michaels cursed, his face red with frustration, but the squad couldn't stop. Elena led them through the last alley, the dummy still across her shoulders, until they reached the extraction point. When the buzzer sounded, the squad collapsed in exhaustion, gasping for air. Elena set the dummy down gently, her arms trembling but her eyes steady. The instructors tallied the results. Elena's squad had one casualty, Michaels, but their time was faster and their accuracy higher than any other. Top squad, Staff Sergeant Miller announced flatly. His eyes flicked toward Elena, not in praise but in acknowledgement, the kind of recognition that said he knew exactly why they had succeeded. Michaels sat in the dirt, his jaw clenched, his pride shattered further. The others, though, looked at Elena differently. Torres gave her a nod of respect, Williams muttered a quiet "nice work," and even Jensen, usually too busy with jokes, simply offered her a fist bump. That night, Michaels couldn't hold back his frustration. In the barracks, as recruits cleaned their gear, he confronted her. "You think you're better than everyone else?" he hissed, low enough that the instructors wouldn't hear but loud enough for nearby recruits to catch every word. Elena didn't look up from her rifle. "I don't think," she said evenly. "I prove." The simplicity of the words hit harder than any insult. The others smirked quietly, hiding their reactions, while Michael's face twisted with fury. He didn't reply. He couldn't. He knew that in this place, words carried no weight unless they were backed by results, and Elena's results spoke louder than his temper ever could. In the weeks that followed, Michael's hostility remained, but the unit had begun to shift around him. More recruits drifted toward Elena, not with open admiration, Marines weren't quick to show that, but with quiet questions, subtle gestures of camaraderie, and an unspoken acceptance. They lined up beside her during drills, matched her pace during runs, copied her shooting stances at the range. It wasn't friendship, not yet, but it was something stronger than the mockery she had faced at the start. It was acknowledgement. Elena, for her part, didn't let it distract her. Every day brought a new test, a new challenge, and she approached each with the same relentless drive. She wasn't chasing their approval. She was chasing something deeper, the promise she had made to herself and to her father that she would stand in the world on her own terms, proving that nothing, not doubt, not ridicule, not tradition could stop her. And as she drifted to sleep each night, exhausted but unbroken, she knew the laughter that had once defined her arrival was gone forever. In its place was silence, the kind of silence that precedes respect. By the time the 5th week began, the recruits had shed whatever fragments of their old civilian selves still clung to them. Their hair was shorn, their voices drilled into the same barked cadence, their movements sharpened into precision by repetition and exhaustion. Yet, beneath the surface of conformity, hierarchies were forming, subtle lines drawn between those who merely endured and those who excelled. Elena had become impossible to ignore. Even the ones who resented her knew it, and those who tried to deny her ability only ended up frustrated when the results contradicted their disbelief. The range had already established her as the finest shot in the unit, the combat simulation had revealed her as a steady presence under pressure, and the daily grind of drills had proven her endurance. What remained now was the ultimate test, the crucible. The crucible was infamous among recruits, whispered about in hushed tones in the barracks as if it were a legend rather than an exercise. 54 hours of near-constant movement, sleep deprivation, and grueling physical and mental challenges designed to replicate the hardship of combat. Packs weighing over 50 pounds, limited rations, forced marches over miles of harsh terrain, obstacle courses that tested every muscle fiber and ounce of willpower. It was the gate between being a recruit and earning the title of Marine. Elena knew this was the trial that mattered most. All the respect she had carved out for herself would mean nothing if she faltered here. The morning it began, the recruits moved out before dawn, their packs biting into their shoulders, rifles slung, eyes bleary but determined. Elena adjusted her straps and fell into step, her body already bracing for the days ahead. The sun rose slowly, casting long shadows over the scrub and dirt trails that stretched for miles. Hours blurred together. Sweat stung eyes, lips cracked from thirst, boots rubbed blisters into heels. The instructors marched alongside them like shadows, barking commands, pushing them harder, always harder. Fatigue set in quickly, dragging at every limb, whispering temptations to slow down, to quit, to collapse. Elena ignored it, focusing on each step, each breath, breaking the endless march into small victories. She had learned long ago that survival came from living moment to moment, not from being crushed by the enormity of the whole. The challenges came one after another. Scaling walls slick with mud, crawling under barbed wire while live rounds cracked overhead, carrying heavy logs as a squad while every muscle screamed. Elena threw herself into each with grim determination. When others faltered, she stepped in, hoisting extra weight, urging them forward with clipped words. She didn't shout or cheerlead, but her steadiness was infectious. Recruits who might have quit instead gritted their teeth and kept going, unwilling to give up in front of someone who refused to bend. Michaels, still nursing his pride, tried to outpace her, charging ahead in the marches, but each time exhaustion forced him to stumble, Elena passed him with steady, measured strides. She didn't glance at him, didn't gloat. The indifference burned him worse than mockery. By the second night, exhaustion was bone deep. The recruits were given only a few hours of restless sleep under the stars, their stomachs hollow from meager rations of crackers and peanut butter. Elena lay on her back, staring up at the indifferent sweep of the Milky Way, her body aching in every joint. Around her, recruits groaned in their sleep, some too tired even to remove their packs. She thought of her father again, his voice echoing in her memory, "Pain is just information. Ignore what doesn't matter." She clenched her jaw, shut her eyes, and let the darkness take her for a brief moment. The final day was the hardest. They were tasked with carrying a mock casualty across uneven terrain for miles, a test of both strength and cooperation. Elena took the front position, heaving the stretcher onto her shoulder, feeling the weight dig into bone. The others rotated, but whenever someone faltered, Elena stepped back in, carrying more than her share. Sweat poured down her face, her arms trembled, her legs burned, but she didn't stop. She thought of every insult, every laugh when she first picked up the rifle, and she let the memory fuel her stride. One step at a time, one breath at a time, until the finish point finally came into sight. When they staggered across the line, filthy, bruised, and half dead from exhaustion, the instructors stood waiting. There were no smiles, no cheers, just the hard, measured gaze of men who had seen countless recruits reach this point. One by one they placed the eagle, globe, and anchor insignia into the recruits' hands, the symbol of the Marine Corps, the proof that they had endured the crucible and emerged as Marines. When Elena's turn came, Staff Sergeant Miller stepped forward. His voice was low but it carried weight. "Ramirez," he said, pressing the insignia into her palm. "You've earned it." For the first time since arriving at Camp Lejeune, Elena allowed herself a small smile. Not wide, not boastful, but quiet, steady, the kind of smile born from knowing you had carried the weight of doubt and crushed it underfoot. Around her, the recruits who had once laughed now stood shoulder to shoulder with her, their eyes reflecting exhaustion, respect, and something else, acceptance. She wasn't just part of the unit anymore. She was part of the Corps. As they raised their voices in the Marine Corps hymn, ragged but proud, Elena clenched the insignia in her fist and lifted her head high. The girl they had mocked was gone. In her place stood a Marine, forged in sweat, grit, and fire, and no one dared to laugh anymore. Graduation day arrived with the crisp snap of uniforms and the pounding cadence of boots striking asphalt. The recruits, now Marines, stood in precise formation under the glare of the sun, their insignia gleaming against pressed fabric, fatigue hidden beneath polished discipline. Families lined the stands, waving flags and craning to catch glimpses of sons and daughters who had been transformed. Elena stood among them, her posture perfect, her expression calm but fierce. When the command rang out and the Marines snapped into salute, the sound reverberated like thunder. For Elena it was more than ceremony, it was vindication. The laughter that had greeted her at the start had been silenced, replaced with respect she had carved into existence with each shot, each march, each sacrifice. But graduation wasn't the end. It was merely the beginning of a greater trial, proving herself not just among recruits, but among active duty Marines hardened by real combat. Her first assignment came sooner than she expected. She was deployed overseas with a unit tasked with providing security and support operations in a volatile region where insurgent activity lurked in every shadow. The desert was harsh and unforgiving, the sun blistering during the day and the nights cold enough to bite through fatigues. Elena carried her rifle with the same familiarity she had shown in training, every movement practiced, every adjustment precise. Yet she knew this was different. Targets at the range didn't shoot back. Simulations didn't leave comrades bleeding. Out here, skill meant survival, hers and those around her. And she was determined not to falter. Her unit was mixed in its reception of her. Some Marines had heard the stories from boot camp, whispers of the recruit who had outshot everyone else. Others judged her fresh status, skeptical of how a young woman barely past training could measure up in real operations. Michaels was gone, assigned elsewhere, but echoes of his resentment lingered in the wary looks of a few Marines. Elena ignored it. She had learned early that words were hollow and that only results mattered. If they doubted her, she would let her actions erase that doubt. The first patrol through the dusty village streets was tense. Children watched from rooftops, women hurried indoors, and men lingered with unreadable expressions. Every shadow seemed a threat, every alley a potential ambush. Elena moved with her squad, eyes sharp, scanning rooftops and windows, her finger brushing lightly against her rifle's trigger guard. When a sudden noise crackled from a side street, the metallic clatter of something hitting the ground, the squad froze. A figure darted away, and in the next instant the sharp crack of gunfire erupted. Bullets tore through the air, slamming into walls, sending villagers screaming for cover. The Marines dove for positions, returning fire in disciplined bursts. Elena slid behind cover, her breath steadying even as adrenaline surged. She scanned for movement, spotting a muzzle flash in a window. In one fluid motion she shouldered her rifle, exhaled, and squeezed the trigger. The shot cut clean, silencing the flash. Her squad leader barked commands, maneuvering the team through the chaos. Another hostile appeared, sprinting across a rooftop, rifle raised. Elena tracked him smoothly and fired. He dropped before he could pull the trigger. Her shots weren't rushed, weren't frantic. They were controlled, precise, the same rhythm she had honed on the range, only now the stakes were life and death. When the firefight ended, the squad regrouped, breathing hard, checking gear and casualties. Miraculously, no Marines had been lost, though one had taken a grazing wound. The insurgents had melted back into the alleys, leaving only silence and dust. The squad leader glanced at Elena, his expression unreadable. "Good shooting, Ramirez," he said finally, his voice flat but edged with genuine respect. The other Marines who had doubted, exchanged looks. They had seen it with their own eyes, her composure, her accuracy, the way she had kept her cool under fire. Whatever doubts they carried had been cracked wide open. That night, in the relative safety of their forward operating base, Elena sat cleaning her rifle under the dim glow of a lantern. The familiar rhythm of brushing, oiling, reassembling soothed the nerves jangling from the day's battle. Around her, Marines spoke in low voices, replaying the firefight, the near misses, the adrenaline still coursing through them. A few glanced her way, and though no one said it outright, she felt the shift. They had entered that patrol with uncertainty about her. They had returned with acknowledgement. Weeks passed, and Elena's reputation grew with every mission. She became known for her unshakable aim, the Marine whose shots always landed where they needed to. Word spread quietly, carried from one squad to another, until her name carried weight even among those who had never served alongside her. She didn't seek recognition, but it followed her nonetheless. Her father's lessons echoed in her mind each time she lined up her sights, each time she steadied her breath under pressure. Control the chaos. Focus. Trust your skill. Yet the reality of war wasn't clean. Elena saw the cost. Villages torn by violence, civilians caught in crossfire, comrades bearing scars both visible and invisible. Each firefight carried risk, and each day brought new challenges. But she didn't waver. Where others faltered under the weight of exhaustion and fear, she stood steady, her resolve hardening with every test. She remembered the laughter at boot camp, the sneers, the doubts, and she carried those memories like fuel. They had laughed when she picked up a rifle. Now, in the unforgiving crucible of combat, it was her rifle that kept them alive. The mission that would define Elena's place among the Marines came with little warning. Intelligence reports suggested insurgents were stockpiling weapons in a cluster of abandoned buildings on the outskirts of a contested city. These weapons, if distributed, could arm dozens of fighters and destabilize the region further. Elena's unit was tasked with reconnaissance and neutralization if necessary. The order was straightforward on paper, but every Marine knew the reality. The enemy wouldn't guard such an arsenal lightly. As they prepped their gear, silence hung over the squad bay, heavy with unspoken understanding. Some Marines cracked nervous jokes, others checked weapons obsessively. Elena simply moved through her routine with calm precision, tightening straps, loading magazines, and double-checking her optics. The convoy rolled out under cover of darkness, engines rumbling low as they snaked through desolate streets. The city loomed ahead, jagged silhouettes of shattered buildings standing like broken teeth against the night sky. Elena rode in the back of the vehicle, her rifle cradled across her knees, eyes scanning the shadows. Every flicker of movement set her instincts on edge, but she steadied herself with slow, controlled breaths. She had been under fire before. She knew fear was natural, but she also knew fear could be mastered. The convoy halted a mile from the objective, and the squad dismounted, moving on foot to avoid detection. Boots crunched softly over rubble as they advanced, weapons at the ready, every sense straining for signs of danger. The building complex emerged from the gloom, crumbling walls, shattered windows, and silence that felt unnaturally thick. The squad leader signaled a halt, motioning Elena and another Marine to flank left and secure Overwatch. They crept through alleys, pressing against walls, every shadow threatening to erupt with gunfire. As they climbed to a vantage point on a half-collapsed structure, Elena set her rifle against the broken ledge, peering through her scope. Below, figures moved inside the target buildings, armed men unloading crates, their weapons glinting faintly in the moonlight. There was no doubt. This was the cache. The squad leader's voice crackled softly in her earpiece. Ramirez, count and mark. We'll breach on your call. Elena tracked the targets carefully, lips moving silently as she counted. A dozen at least, maybe more. She marked positions, noting entry points, lines of fire, and blind spots. When she reported back, her voice was steady. The leader gave the order. The squad advanced, slipping into position, preparing for the breach. Elena tightened her grip on the rifle, knowing her role was critical. The moment her squad burst through those doors, all hell would break loose. Her job was to cover them, to cut down threats before they could overwhelm her team. The explosion of the breach shattered the night, a thunderous roar followed by shouts and the crack of automatic fire. Marines stormed the building and chaos erupted instantly. Insurgents scrambled, firing wildly, bullets tearing through plaster and stone. Elena's scope locked onto the first hostile, raising a rifle toward the door. She fired. He dropped. She shifted smoothly, another target in sight, another squeeze of the trigger, another man falling before he could shoot. Her shots were precise, controlled, never wasted. Each pull of the trigger meant one less threat facing her squad below. The firefight raged, echoing through the broken city. Marines called out, moving through rooms, suppressing enemy fire, clearing space inch by bloody inch. Elena worked with surgical precision, covering them from above. She saw a Marine pinned by gunfire from a balcony and adjusted, her rifle kicking against her shoulder as she put a round through the shooter's chest. She spotted two insurgents moving to flank the squad's rear entry and dropped them both before they reached the door. Her presence turned the tide. Where her squad might have been overwhelmed, they pressed forward, momentum shifting in their favor. But the battle wasn't over. A sudden burst of movement caught Elena's eye, a man dragging a heavy RPG launcher from a crate, his intent clear. If he fired into the building, Marines inside would be torn apart. Elena's pulse hammered, but her breath slowed. She steadied her aim, every ounce of focus narrowing to that single figure. She squeezed the trigger just as he raised the weapon. The shot struck clean, dropping him before he could launch death into the fray. The relief was immediate but short-lived. More gunfire erupted from a hidden pocket of insurgents, spraying the Overwatch position. Debris exploded around Elena, shards of concrete slicing her cheek as bullets whined past. She ducked, rolled, and returned fire, taking down one attacker then another. Her partner at Overwatch covered her flank, together holding their ground under the onslaught. Inside, the Marines secured the cache, detonating explosives on crates of weapons they couldn't extract. Flames licked upward, black smoke curling into the night. The order came to withdraw, and Elena provided covering fire as the squad pulled back, every shot buying them precious seconds. When the last Marine cleared the building, Elena descended from her perch, sprinting through dust and gunfire to regroup with her unit. They fell back in disciplined formation, the thunder of secondary explosions rocking the ground as the weapons stockpile ignited. The night sky lit with fire, and the roar of destruction echoed like a storm. At the extraction point, Marines collapsed into the dirt, sweat-soaked, hearts still pounding. The squad leader scanned them, counting, checking, relief flickering across his face when he saw they had all made it. Then his gaze settled on Elena. "Ramirez," he said, his voice low but carrying weight, "you saved this squad tonight. Don't think we didn't see it." The words hung in the air, undeniable and unchallenged. The other Marines, hardened and bloodied, looked at her not with doubt, but with recognition. She had proved herself not just in training, not just in controlled skirmishes, but in the crucible of a mission that could have gone catastrophically wrong. That night, as they rode back in the convoy, The city's fires fading into the distance, Elena rested her head against the cold metal wall of the vehicle. Exhaustion pressed heavy, but beneath it ran a quiet, fierce pride. She remembered the smirks, the dismissive laughter of those first days in training. They had laughed when she grabbed a rifle. Now, her rifle had not only silenced enemies but had shielded every Marine in her unit. Respect wasn't given easily in the Corps, it was earned in blood, fire, and sacrifice. And she had earned it. The days after the weapons cache mission blurred into one another, filled with debriefs, maintenance, and restless nights haunted by echoes of gunfire. Yet something had shifted in the way her fellow Marines looked at her. The sideways glances were no longer laced with doubt but with acknowledgement. Whispers of "Ramirez saved our asses" traveled faster than official reports ever could, threading through the unit like wildfire. Marines she had never spoken to before nodded at her in the chow line. Some asked for pointers on marksmanship, their voices low but respectful, as if speaking to someone who carried knowledge earned in the flames of combat. For Elena it was surreal. She had not fought for their respect. She had fought for survival, for the mission, for her brothers and sisters in arms. But in the Corps that was the very currency respect was minted from. Her commanding officer called her into his office 3 days later, the air still smelling faintly of burnt cordite from the cache destruction. He stood behind his desk, expression stern but tinged with something unspoken, approval, maybe pride. "Sit down, Ramirez," he said, though his tone held no trace of casualness. He slid a file across the desk, the crisp edge catching in the dim light. "Reports from your last mission. Every squad member, every after-action statement, they all say the same thing: without your overwatch the mission would have failed. We would have lost Marines." Elena sat rigid, hands clenched on her knees. It wasn't sure how to respond. Praise felt heavier than any reprimand. He studied her for a long moment before continuing. "I'm putting you in for a commendation. Navy and Marine Corps Achievement Medal. But more than that, I want you to consider advanced sniper school. We need Marines like you, Ramirez, steady hands, sharp eyes, and the guts to do what needs to be done." The weight of his words hit her harder than any recoil. Advanced sniper school was no small offer. It meant recognition, specialization, a path forward that only the best were given. She thought of the little girl clutching her father's uniform sleeve, begging him not to leave, only to watch him march into eternity. She thought of the sergeant who had dismissed her as too soft for combat, of the grueling weeks where failure had seemed inevitable. And now here she was, being told she was exactly what the Corps needed. For a moment she felt the sting of tears behind her eyes, but she blinked them away. Marines didn't cry in front of their CO. She nodded once, firm. "I'll do it, sir." Sniper school was another crucible, different but equally brutal. It demanded perfection in patience, stealth, and precision. Days of crawling through mud, holding her breath until her lungs burned, waiting for the single perfect moment to pull the trigger. Nights of calculating windage under starlight, of memorizing the rhythm of her own heartbeat to steady her shot. Instructors who had once eyed her skeptically now pushed her harder, but Elena welcomed it. Every round she fired, every grueling stalk through terrain, carried not just the weight of the Corps' expectations but of her own relentless will. She was no longer proving them wrong, she was proving herself right. By the time she graduated, she wasn't just another Marine with a rifle. She was a sniper, part of a lineage of warriors who turned patience and precision into power. Her reputation preceded her back to the front lines. Units whispered her name like a quiet reassurance. If Ramirez was covering them, they had a chance. The battlefield became her canvas, each shot a brushstroke in a painting only she could see, calculated and executed with icy clarity. From rooftops, from ridgelines, from the shadows where only silence lived, she struck with deadly certainty. Enemies who thought themselves untouchable fell before they even knew she was there. But beyond the kills, beyond the missions, Elena found something deeper in the silence of her scope. She found clarity. In those moments before pulling the trigger, when time stretched and the world narrowed to a single breath, she understood herself. The doubts that had plagued her as a recruit, the pain of her father's loss, the years of being underestimated, they had forged her into exactly who she was meant to be. Not a shadow of her father, not a novelty in the Corps, but a Marine who carried her own legend. Her story spread, carried not in headlines but in the quiet retellings of Marines around fire barrels, in barracks bunks, in convoys rumbling through hostile streets. They spoke of Ramirez, the one who saw through chaos, who covered them when no one else could, who never missed when it mattered most. Respect had transformed into trust, and trust into something rarer, reverence. She wasn't just part of the Corps anymore. She was one of the names etched into its living history, proof that determination could carve a path where none existed. Years later, when Elena herself wore stripes on her sleeve and rookies looked at her with the same skepticism she once endured, she didn't waste time on long speeches. Instead, she handed them a rifle, sent them to the range and said only, "Prove it." Because she knew that in the end, words meant nothing compared to action. Her journey had taught her that the Marine Corps didn't care about where you came from, what doubts haunted you, or who thought you couldn't do it. The only thing that mattered was whether, when the moment came, you could hold steady, breathe and pull the trigger. Elena Ramirez had arrived at the Corps as a girl desperate to honor her father's memory, dismissed as too small, too soft, too fragile. She became a Marine who commanded respect not through demand, but through unshakable resolve and undeniable skill. And as long as her story lived on, whispered from one generation of Marines to the next, it would carry the same message she had written in blood, sweat and fire. Respect is not given, it is earned, and she had earned it 1,000 times over. The end.